Sunday, May 8th, the faith of Abraham. Genesis 15, 1-21. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me, since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus? And Abram said, You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him, This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. He took him outside and said, Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. And then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. He also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? So the Lord said to him, Bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, To your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaites, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. Also read Romans 4:3, 4, 9, and 22. How does Abraham reveal what it means to live by faith? What is the meaning of the sacrifice that God had Abraham perform? God's first response to Abraham's concern about an heir, Genesis 15:1-3, is that he will have a son from his own body. Genesis 15:4. The same language is used by the prophet Nathan to refer to the seed of the future Messianic king, 2nd book of Samuel 7:12. Abram was reassured and believed in the Lord, Genesis 15:6, because he understood that the fulfillment of God's promise depended not on his own righteousness but on God's, Genesis 15:6, compared with Romans 4:5 and 6. This notion is extraordinary, especially in that culture. In the religion of the ancient Egyptians, for instance, judgment was made on the basis of counting one's human works of righteousness against the righteousness of the goddess Maat, who represented divine righteousness. In short, you had to earn salvation. God then sets up a sacrificial ceremony for Abraham to perform. Basically, the sacrifice points to Christ's death for our sins. Humans are saved by grace, the gift of God's righteousness, symbolized by these sacrifices. But this particular ceremony conveys specific messages for Abraham. The praying of the vultures on the sacrificial animals, Genesis 15, 9-11, means that Abraham's descendants will suffer slavery for a period of 400 years, Genesis 15:13, or 4 generations. That in the 4th generation, Abraham's descendants shall return here, Genesis 15:16. The last scene of the sacrificial ceremony is dramatic, a burning torch that passed between those pieces, Genesis 15:17. This extraordinary burning torch, wonder, signifies God's commitment to fulfill his covenant promise of giving land to Abraham's descendants, Genesis 15:18. The boundaries of this promised land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, Genesis 15:18, reminds us of the boundaries of the Garden of Eden, compared with Genesis 2:13 and 14. This prophecy has therefore more in view than just the Exodus, any homeland for Israel. On the distant horizon of this prophecy, in Abraham's descendants taking the country of Canaan, looms the idea of the end-time salvation of God's people who will return to the Garden of Eden. How can we learn to keep focused on Christ and his righteousness as our only hope of salvation? What happens if we try to start counting up our good works? From the book Patriarchs and Prophets, page 137, it says, "The patriarch begged for some visible token as a confirmation of his faith and as an evidence to after generations that God's gracious purpose toward them would be accomplished. The Lord condescended to enter into a covenant with his servant, employing such forms as were customary among men for the ratification of a solemn engagement. By divine direction, Abraham sacrificed a heifer, a she-goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, dividing the bodies and laying the pieces a little distance apart. To these he added a turtle dove and a young pigeon, which, however, were not divided. This being done, he reverently passed between the parts of the sacrifice, making a solemn vow to God of perpetual obedience. Watchful and steadfast, he remained beside the carcasses till the going down of the sun, to guard them from being defiled or devoured by birds of prey. At about sunset, he sank into a deep sleep, and lo, a horror of great darkness fell upon him, and the voice of God was heard, bidding him not to expect immediate possession of the promised land, and pointing forward to the sufferings of his posterity before their establishment in Canaan. The plan of redemption was here open to him in the death of Christ, the great sacrifice, and his coming in glory. Abraham saw also the earth restored to its Eden beauty, to be given him for an everlasting possession as the final and complete fulfillment of the promise. As a pledge of this covenant of God with men, a smoking furnace and a burning lamp, symbols of the divine presence, passed between the severed victims, totally consuming them. And again, a voice was heard by Abraham, confirming the gift of the land of Canaan to his descendants. From the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates.